Yes, I'm aware the cases are climbing again. The brunette muttered into the phone, her brow furrowing in frustration. No, we haven't figured out why the symptoms are worse this time. Yes, I'm a. She clamped her jaw shut, anger boiling in her veins, as the woman on the other end screamed at her. She was tired of having to field 3 or more calls a day about a virus no one knew anything about. She was fed up with being made to feel like they were all scum and not doing enough while the talents that called her did nothing but force her into this daily calls. If only they would come down from their lofty towers, they would see the destruction that was looming. If only they would help them, give them more resources to combat the disease. Yes, Madame Strumpfiggery, if we learn of anything new about the virus, you'll be the first to know. Yes, all right, goodbye. Having a heavy sigh, she leaned back in her chair after hanging up the phone, running her hands over her face. When had things gone so terribly wrong? When they jumped through the portal, most of the refugees had lost their magic. 2 sorcerers and all the bards and barderesses had managed to maintain theirs. The ones with magic promptly took control of the new land, forming a ruling party. They called themselves the Talents, and those that had lost their magic, like Nissa, were labeled the Talentless. There were rumors that others had retained their magic, but once the talents caught wind, they'd disappear. With the sudden onset of the virus and the unrest that had been brewing due to the unfair treatment of the talentless, many people thought they had devised this as yet another way to control them. Anything to keep their grip on the power they had given themselves. Anything to keep from falling from grace. New whispers were flying with the new cases appearing. Many thought the talents had underestimated the virus and they'd lost control of it. And Nissa was beginning to wonder if they were right. Walking death. That's what they were calling the virus. That was picking off the refugees faster than they could count. It had appeared 6 months ago, presenting in a young Fae child, only 6 years old. At first, the symptoms were mild, mimicking the signs of a cold, runny nose, sore throat, and a cough. Nothing they hadn't seen before, here or on Avilier. 2 weeks later, they began changing, mutating at a rapid rate. Phenomena, bronchitis, or sorry, pneumonia and bronchitis, and a burning rash. While it had been difficult for some to keep up with the changes and the rapid increase in cases, the brunette had relied heavily on her knowledge of herbs to help combat the symptoms. Everything was easily managed. Something had changed. Scattered across her desk were pages and pages of notes on the disease, limbs rotted and putrid, bleeding from eyes and ears, teeth falling out, and arteries erupting. There was even a report from 2 towns over that one corpse had came back to life and tried to attack the nurse in the room. It was quickly put down and a sample taken before they had burnt it. Her husband had gone missing after stepping through the portal. They had been separated in what she told herself. So she had been throwing herself into her work. She'd spent countless hours poring over endless labs and temperature checks. She'd watched the disease destroy healthy cells in a matter of minutes. She had held the hands of more people dying than she cared to admit, and cried after every single one of them died. Healthy, innocent people were dying. It wasn't supposed to be this way. It wasn't supposed to be this hard. A blood-curdling shriek rang out, and she was on her feet in seconds, running for the door of her office, pulling the mask on her face. She hit the hallway. She could smell the familiar metallic smell of blood. Clenching her jaw, she ran towards the screaming. She entered the room and slid in a pool of blood on the floor. The patient's artery had ruptured, making him bleed out in a matter of seconds. And the screaming, was coming from his young pregnant wife. Nothing could be done for the young halfling patient, so she moved over to his wife, a woman named Ascara. Ascara, she called out, ducking her head to force the woman to look at her. You can't be in here. We need to get out. We need to get you out. Come with me. I'm not leaving him. Don't make me leave him, Nissa, she cried, trying to fight Empath off. Nissa held strong and took the woman's beating until she collapsed into her arms. Don't make me leave him, she sobbed, blood-covered hands gripping the white coat. Whispering soothing words, Nissa led the woman into a quiet room with chairs and a table, sending a nurse for some water, and sat with Ascara until she settled. A soft knock on the door revealed a cleric, and while they could no longer bring someone back, they still offered comfort to the ones that were left behind. Taking her leave, she stepped into the hall and steadied herself against the wall. The room spun for a moment, faces blurring, and the sounds of chaos fading away to nothing as the brunette stood in the middle of it all and closed her eyes. When she had stepped through the portal all those years ago, never did she think they would be facing chaos like this. It was supposed to be better, their promised land. But this wasn't promised land. This was hell on earth. The sounds rushed back, hitting her like a ton of bricks, and she inhaled sharply, eyes flying open. All around her, people were rushing past with gurneys filled with people dying, gasping for air, praying to the old gods and new to save them. But the old gods had no power here, and honestly, the new gods didn't seem to have a handle on anything either. All these poor, unfortunate souls had to save them were empaths with no magic, who were just as lost as everyone else. It is. Get over here, her colleague shouted, and she ran over, pulling her stethoscope from around her neck and fitting it in her ears as she listened to the rundown. She's just the same as the others. Fever, trouble breathing. She can't keep anything down, and her heart rate is erratic. Her skin is starting to peel. Nissa, met Effie's gaze across the patient between them. They were out of ventilators. Not 24 hours ago, Effie and she had spoken about this exact scenario. They both say it, if things didn't start improving, they were going to have to start deciding who lived and who died. Less than 24 hours later, they were living it. Who is she? Tell me about her, Nissa asked, gently pushing on the patient's chest, watching closely for changes. Her name is Asana, 25, human originally from Bontra. Effie paused before meeting Sia's gaze. She has 2 kids at home. Her heart skipped a beat as the Fae's words sunk in, running over the patients already ventilated in her head. One jumped out. Esselin. She was an older F. She lived a long life, and before she was ventilated, she had made Nissa promise that if someone younger came in who needed the ventilator, that she'd take it off her. Closing her eyes for a moment, she finally spoke. Keep her hydrated. I'll be back. Nissa, where are you? Effie asked, but the elf was already gone. She left emergent care, ripping her mask off and throwing it into the bin. Jogging down the hall, she headed for the isolation wing, only stopping when she reached the observation window. Her heart was racing, her eyes filled with tears, and she wanted nothing more than to keep running. This was not what she wanted. This was not what she had signed up for. She'd been able to save everyone at one point. She hadn't had to make these decisions. She didn't want this responsibility. Scrubbing her hands, she gowned up completely with a mask covering her nose and mouth. Entering the isolation wing was as eerie as it was heartbreaking. The sounds of machines humming to keep these people alive, the beeping of heart monitors, and the hiss of air. Slow, measured steps carried her to Aslan's bedside, and she sat down in the chair provided. She was quiet for a moment, taking in the peaceful expression on the woman's face. How she didn't look a day over 300 at 683. She'd never know. It wasn't fair of you to make me promise that, she spoke softly, her words thick with emotion. I know why you requested it, but why did it have to be me? Reaching out, she took the woman's hand in her own, a gloved thumb running lightly over the wrinkled skin. I don't know what I'm doing. I can't do this without you here. Her eyes burned and teared. Tears began to fall as she blinked. Leaning forward, she pressed the woman's hand to her forehead as a heart-wrenching sob escaped. She gripped her hand, the sheets on the bed, as if they were the only things keeping her afloat, the only things giving her hope. Don't make me do this. Please wake up, please, she sobbed, begging the woman, pleading for any sign of improvement. I don't want this. Her body shook with her ragged sobs, releasing all her fears, her doubts, and her suspicions. Through her tears, her mask was soaked by the time she started to settle down, and she used her own gown to wipe her face. A sad laugh left her lips as she looked at the woman. "Do you remember when I fell down the steps at our estate and scraped my knee? I started crying, and you scooped me up and held me, kissed my hands until I felt better. You promised me that you'd always be there when I needed you, that I'd never be alone." She paused for a moment to maintain her composure, to swallow down her emotions. "I don't want to be alone, grandmother." Letting out a shaky breath, she rose to her feet and smoothed the woman's hair. Leaning down, she pressed her cheek to the older woman's and breathed in her scent one last time. She pressed a masked kiss to her forehead and let another tear roll down her face. The tears continued falling as she turned to the machines and slowly, one by one, turned them off. The silence was defining, and she stayed by her grandmother's side until she drew her last breath and her heart stopped. She hurried back to prep the room and stripped all of her gear off, slamming them into the garbage can before kicking the metal container. It took her a moment more to regain her composure, and once she did, she stepped into the hall. Effie, bless her heart, nearly walked into her, and she gasped softly, "There you are. Are you all right? Have you decided?" Effie was cut off as Nissan pushed her past her. "Give her Eslin's." Blinking in surprise, Effie called after her friend. "Eslin's? Are you sure?" But Nissan didn't answer. Effie would have her answer as soon as she walked into the isolation room. The sounds of the machines, the shouting of voices, it was all too much. She had been dealing with every single day since this started. She couldn't anymore. Jogging to the exit, stopping only when she reached outside, her emotions finally came to a head. A sour taste hit her mouth, and she had just enough time to reach the garbage can before everything in her stomach came up. And Aviller, they could help everyone. They could save everyone. She didn't sign up for playing God. She didn't want this burden. A frustrated scream left her lips as she sank to the ground, back pressed against the brick wall. Slender fingers covered her face as tears began to fall. So much had happened in so little time. Losing her husband, the virus, running rapid, losing the control she'd had over her life. And now her grandmother was gone, but her husband was out there somewhere. She knew he was, but she didn't know where. She didn't know if he was okay. She didn't know anything. The only thing she knew for sure was that if Azra hadn't already had her soul, he would have it by the end of this.